Hey, listener. I know this is supposed to be a wine podcast, but today we're going off the usual path and learn about sake for two reasons. First, October 1st is World Sake Day, so there's a built in excuse for you to give it a try. And secondly, even though sake is a completely different type of beverage, the reasons that people get really excited about sake are many of the same reasons that people geek out on wine. So if you have an open mind, and you always wanted to give sake a try but didn't know where to start, listen up. This is the Inside Wine Podcast. I'm Joe Janish, a certified specialist of wine and wine industry professional since 1996, giving you insider tips to make the right wine decisions. All right, and so today we are going to talk about sake, and we have an expert with us today. Today our guest is Ryan Mellinger. She is the general manager of Joto Sake at Co-Brand Corporation. She's been working with Joto for 10 years. She's a WSET Level 3 and certified sake scholar, which means she knows a heck of a lot more than most people about the beverage. And Ryan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Joe. I'm happy to be here.
Great. So first things first, am I saying it properly? Is it sake? Because I've heard people say like sake and like something that you would throw into a hamper. Like that's not the way you say it. What is the proper way to say this? How do you pronounce it?
Thank you. Yeah, let's start with the basics. Sake. I always think, okay, sake. Unfortunately, I think it was Austin Powers kind of coined sake and made that very popular in the
Yeah.
United States.
Yeah, that's right. That's where that came from. Yeah.
But if you want to sound like you know what you're talking about, at least order properly, you want to say sake.
Okay. See what I did there?
Yeah.
Okay, sake. Great. So, our listener is, a wine person, a wine geek, maybe, and maybe has tried sake, maybe not. So maybe we'll give them just a little introduction. So first of all, it's not rice wine, right?
Yes, no, it's not. It's a misnomer to call it rice wine. Back a long time ago when sake was first reaching a broader consumer base in the United States, it was very, I think, easier to sell sake by calling it rice wine, relating it to something more familiar with American consumers. But wine is something that's fermented from a fruit, and sake is not that at all. They do share a handful of things in common, such as you can sip it out of a nice stemmed glass. It has great aroma, can be fruity and served chilled. Sip on it with your meal. But the process by which it's made is completely different because it's made from a grain. It's made from rice. So there's no inherent sugar in rice like there is with grapes. So you can't just, squish the rice and get the sugary substance to ferment. So you need to do a more serious or thorough, rather, brewing process that is unique to sake. So it's not a rice wine. It's a fermented beverage from rice that is the national drink of Japan.
Okay. And one of the reasons that we are talking about sake today is because coming up very quickly is World Sake Day, which is October 1st. So maybe you could tell us why that's so important.
Yes, so World Sake Day celebrates the harvest of the sake rice and the transition of the seasons from, of course, the harvest season in fall. We're all familiar with that, what that means, but we're going into the brewing season. So sake today is unique in that quality sake is generally only brewed in the wintertime from about November through March. So every year the sake rice is harvested after the summer and they go into the brewing season. And it's important for quality sake that you are brewing in cold temperatures, doing a long and slow cold fermentation to really manage the fermentation process and the activity of the yeast, etc. And that's what produces beautiful quality sake.
All right. So Ryan, like a person who is into wine, they probably like different varieties of wine, different types of grapes, maybe different regions. Like, so how does that work with sake? Is it like, do people go for different types of rices? Are there different types of rices, or like what makes one sake different from another?
There's so many different ways you can make one sake. Terroir with sake is very different than it is with wine. But there are different rice varietals. So the harvest time of the season can, you'll be working with many different types of sake rice. And actually, you can also make sake from table rice, but oftentimes premium sake is made from rice that has been specifically developed for making sake. And there's rice varietals that grow better in different regions. But one of the major differences, again, between a grain and a fruit is once you harvest the rice, whether it's in the north or in the south, you can store it and you can wait until you're ready to ferment or start your brewing process. Unlike when you harvest the grapes, you really don't have, you can't just store them and say, okay, I'm going to start making wine from this in a few months. You have to get going now. So that's one of the major differences, again, from sake and wine. But in addition to the rice varietal, which can impart different qualities in terms of more of the sugar levels that will be provided in the brewing process or a little bit of the flavor profile, but a lot of the character of the sake actually comes down to the touch of the master brewer, if you will. Because once the rice enters the brewing facility, there's a few other components that can really play a big part of how the sake will turn out in the end. So sake is comprised not just of rice, but also of water and yeast and something called koji. So where your water comes from, or the softness or hardness of your water, will also determine how the sake is fermented and tastes in the final bottling. The yeast is very important for aromatic purposes. So there's many different types of yeast that brewers can choose. The master brewer can choose to affect a different type of sake. And then lastly, koji, which is very unique to sake making and some other fermented products in parts of Asia, is responsible for breaking down the starch in the rice into sugar. So it's sort of like this malting process that would happen with beer or whiskey. That step is not needed with wine because the sugars are already inherent in the grape juice. So koji is responsible for that extra step. And the way in which koji is made or produced in the brewing process can also have an effect on the style of the sake. So those are just four right off the bat, but then there's all these like really tiny choices that they make throughout that can affect a different change. And most breweries make many different types of sake. So it's better almost to think about a sake brewery like a craft beer brewery, in which a craft beer brewery might make a lager or an IPA or a pilsner, all within their same house style or whichever style they have become known for. And sake breweries operate much like that in that they can make different types of sake, but there's some unifying ethos that guides their stylistic choices. So many different levers you can pull to make a different sake.
Yeah, it sounds a lot more complicated than I expected. Wine, it's, you talk to the winemaker and it's like, oh, I'm just allowing the terroir to come through in the glass. And I know they do more than that, but it sounds like there's a lot of different ways you can kind of manipulate, or that's probably not the right word, but like,
Yeah, but yes, absolutely. And there's styles that certain regions of Japan are maybe perhaps more known for, whether that was because there was a group of breweries that started early that made and collaborated on certain styles that made that region famous, or maybe there's a certain type of cuisine or temperature of a certain region that dictated, what food and then drink they would want to go with that. But that said, you can have two breweries, on the same street making sake from the same local rice, and they could be completely different styles. So it's not going to give you the same parallels that, harvesting a certain grape in a certain region would to the final product. So it makes sake very interesting and also very kind of magical in my mind, because you're starting with very simple basic ingredients, but then once it's in the brewery there's so much more going on, and it's very labor intensive process. And I've been to wineries on winery tours, and you go through, you're seeing the vats, and I know that there's work that the winery employees are doing on a daily basis and testing and making sure, but really there's so much more importance, I think, placed on the growing of the grapes, because if you have a bad harvest, you're kind of not set up for success. With rice, if you do have a harvest, with climate change, there are differences in the way the sake rice is acting in the fermentation, but there's all these different methods that the brewers can activate to kind of make up for some of those differences year to year. So there's a little bit more opportunity there you really do taste the brewer's hand a lot more. And like I said, it's so labor intensive. I mean, you go to a brewery on a brewery tour in the middle of the brewing season, and it is super active. Some of our breweries are very small and they only have a handful of people working, and some of them are a bit larger and they might have 10 people on staff doing the brewing during the season. But there is something happening in every corner of the brewery, someone who's responsible for different process and activity. And it's, heavy work. There's a lot of like bending over and lifting and working in cold temperatures. So yeah, a lot of passion and like literally hands go into making a bottle of sake.
Okay. So I could see like where their parallels are, like people who are into wine, they get into the dirt and they get into the different types of barrels and toasting and grapes and everything else. So I could see where there's some parallels and where a wine person could get into sake. Now that I know how complicated it is, how can we like dumb it down a little bit for the average person who's just wants to kind of like, we want to celebrate World Sake Day. Like, how do we get started? Like, where do you start and what should you look for?
Well, I think the best way to start is just grab a bottle of sake and start trying. Google maybe closest sake bar to me or something like that. And what's wonderful about sake, much like wine, is that it's not. Some people who maybe haven't had it or haven't had it in a long time might confuse it for a distilled spirit, in which you would take a shot and it might feel very strong or it'd be in a cocktail. Sake, even though it's made from rice and it's brewed, it's about 15 to 16% alcohol, so a little bit stronger than wine, but still very sippable and smooth on the palate, easy drinking. So you can have a glass with your meal. You can have a couple glasses and taste different styles. So it's really fantastic to go to a sake bar because they will have a handful of selections organized by flavor profile, and you can start to see what you like better. One of the best things about sake that is very different from wine is that once you open a bottle, it keeps for about 6 weeks and sometimes even longer. It doesn't start to sour or turn to vinegar from exposure to oxygen. So what that means in practice is that restaurants and sake bars that have a sake list tend to offer a lot of different options by the glass because they can reliably have all those bottles open for extended periods of time, which means you, as the sake drinker, just going to the bar, gets to try so many different things that maybe otherwise you wouldn't be able to just have a glass of. You might have to commit to a whole bottle. So pretty cool in that way. So I always say, find your local sake bar. That's where the people are going to be the most educated and passionate about sake, and they can start to show you what is a sake that's a little bit more earthy or savory, and on the drier side, those tend to be something like junmai sake, or what's something that's a little more fruity, like a white wine, has nice aromatics of tropical fruit, but a little bit creamy, but still very nice acidity on the palate. And they might direct you to junmai ginjo style. Or you want something that's like the best of the best and you're treating yourself for a special occasion, a birthday, an anniversary, or just, a good old Wednesday where you feel like treating yourself. They might recommend a Junmai Dai Ginjo, which tends to be the highest level that a sake brewery might make, and very, very silky on the palate, very delicate aromatics, and just very pretty in the glass to enjoy. So definitely seek out a place where you can try a couple of different styles. And in terms of how to, navigate the different naming conventions, that's also difficult if you're not used to drinking sake or haven't ordered it before, because it's going to be completely different than wine or beer. But like I said, you can look for a couple of keywords. So junmai means pure rice. So it's a style of sake that only uses those ingredients we talked about: rice, water, yeast, and koji. And you can expect a certain level of quality when you order a junmai sake. And then if you see the word ginjo at all, that tells you that the sake is usually going to be a little more fruity and aromatic and a little bit acidity. And this is referring to a method in which the rice is actually polished before brewing. And you don't have to get into the nitty gritty of why that is, but just it's good to know that the word ginjo is sort of like this middle tier and tends to get a little more aromatic than your regular junmai sake. And then, as I said, the word dai ginjo means great or highly polished, greatly ginjo, and it's usually going to be the most expensive on the list, but will really give you an idea of what a very high level of production of sake will look like. But like I said, it's kind of like beer in that, different breweries have different philosophies and house styles. So another fun thing to do, which I like to do if possible, is find one producer and then try a couple of different sakes from the same producer on the menu. And you can also start to see through lines with their technique or flavor profiles at a range of methods and prices. I think that's a really fun way to try sake as well.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good plan. So you generally are going to go to different brands. I guess they're called breweries or houses or whatever.
Mhm.
Do most of these breweries stick with the same brewer over many years, or do they switch around? Or is it like the flying winemakers that come in and consult? Or
No, yeah, no, these are, especially our portfolio, the Jodo sake portfolio, but by and large, most sake producers in Japan, there's a lot of pride placed on continuity and consistency and generation. So all of our producers in our portfolio are family owned small producers, and the toji is often the owner or the president of the brewery. The toji is the master brewer, and it'll be the same team for a whole generation
okay,
if possible. Yeah.
all right. So if you like a particular brand, you probably stick with that as a start.
Oh, yeah. It's extremely consistent year over year. Even generational shifts, they're slow to change. So, if you like one sake, for example, one of our brewers is called Shichi Honyari or Seven Spearsmen. If you like Seven Spearsmen sake, you had it 3 years ago, a sake from them. You can pick up the same sake or the same sake from this brewery, and it will taste pretty much exactly the same as it did then. Yeah, as long as it was stored properly, there shouldn't be much change because they're going for consistency every year when they're brewing the sake.
Okay, that leads me to a new question that I hadn't thought of before. Are there vintages? Like, is one vintage better than another, like it is in wine, or is it pretty much consistent year over year?
Yeah, so it's consistent year over year. There are a small growing interest in perhaps dipping into sort of this more wine industry style of vintages, but it's very different, as I said, because unlike grapes, where the harvest is so important and the climate of the growing season is really going to dictate the final product, with sake, it's not all about the harvest of the rice. It's also about all of the other methods that the brewery imparts through the season. So it's really a very consistent. There are no vintages. Sake is being made every year, but they roll right into one another, the releases. So it's consistent, much like beer. So, if you've had a local microbrewery beer 2 years ago and they're making that same recipe today, it should taste pretty much the same. And, another question that usually piggybacks off of vintages is, well, is sake stored? So typically sake, when it's made, it's maybe stored at the brewery for a few months just to kind of settle in the bottle and round out. But after that, it's released. And by the way, it's also stored in freezer conditions. So there's no changes happening really to the liquid in that state. So it's released, fresh every time and constantly. So, as an importer, we are importing from Japan every 3 months. We have orders. So it's just a continual replenishing of inventory. So there's no aging of product or storing product for extended periods of time. So if someone gifted you a bottle of sake from maybe a recent trip to Japan or a domestic sake brewery, don't put it away in the cellar and age it for a few years and take it out, expecting it to taste how the brewer intended it to. So you might just go for it and find, that that Wednesday where you need to celebrate and open it up.
Okay. It sounds a lot like beer in that way. Like it's just open it up and enjoy it. No need to, like you said, cellar it. Okay. So I have a really dumb question. I feel a little silly asking this. My first introduction to sake, years and years ago, was at a sushi restaurant, and it was served hot. Once I got to Cobra and was introduced to sake, the proper ways, it seems like it's served chilled, slightly chilled. How are you supposed to drink it, and why is it some sake hot and some sake cold and some in between? Like, what should we be doing as far as the temperature?
I know it's a little bit confusing because, and me too, Joe, when I first, when I was in college in New York City with not a lot of money to spend, we would go seek out the mom and pop spot, and they would give us, shots of hot sake with our meal. In America, oftentimes that's how people have first experienced sake. And that's, I think, oftentimes because the dominant sake, especially growing up for me and for you when you first started drinking sake, is some of the biggest sake companies just having bigger distribution and availability. And oftentimes, this sort of less expensive sake can be served warm. And perhaps if it's not even made super well or with the best ingredients, maybe it'll have some off flavors that maybe are best enjoyed warm. But that said, there's been a huge shift in how the quality of the sake being imported into the United States today and the consumption of sake. So there's so many different, as I explained, styles and methods and variables that can change the sake. And when it's served like a white wine in a glass, you can really get all of those different characters. So today, most premium sake is enjoyed chilled like a white wine in a glass. However, that's not to say that all sake served warm is, mass produced or not the highest quality. There is a wonderful tradition and history in Japan of serving sake warm in the wintertime. And there's certain sakes that actually can open up and become a lot more round when they're heated up a bit. And this can be a very high quality sake. So as United States become more knowledgeable and experienced with drinking sake, you can start to appreciate the different styles. But by and large, most sake is produced to be drunk chilled like a white wine or just a little bit room temperature. And if you go to a sake bar and they really know what they're doing, they can offer a very high level service of warm sake as opposed to just the box sake from a heating container where you pull the lever and some hot liquid comes out.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that explanation. So generally speaking, you just serve it like you would a white wine, probably not too cold, but just cool enough chilled about.
Yeah, and generally a rule of thumb is the more aromatic and fruity the style of sake is, the better it will be chilled. And if a sake tends to have more savory or earthy profile, sometimes those will lend themselves to be warmed. But, for someone who's just getting into sake, just stick with the chilled stuff, and there's plenty to taste in that arena. And then, as you get more experience, you can start to, or if the weather gets colder, you can start to experiment with warm sake. But it is a very unique beverage in that it can be served at a range of temperatures, unlike wine or beer. It's pretty versatile in that way.
Interesting. So, we're talking about premium sake, fine sake. How much money is a person going to spend on a bottle? And by the way, it seems like there's all kinds of different sizes bottles. I see little tiny bottles. I see medium sized bottles. I see massive bottles. Like, how can we point the listener to a starting point as far as how much to spend for something is it $15? Is it 25? Like where should somebody start with their if they were going to a retailer, if they didn't have an opportunity to, not every city or town has a sake bar. So you have to you're standing in a retailer, what are some just real basic general rules of thumb for picking something?
Well, in Japan, they actually have a different bottling standard. So with wine, you'll see 750 milliliter. With sake, the most similar equivalent is a 720 ml. So it'll look the same on the shelf, I'd say go for those bottles. There are smaller ones, but once you open it, it doesn't last very long. So I go for just the standard size 720 milliliter, very similar to a wine bottle. And you're right, there are some even larger bottles, and those are generally geared towards the restaurant side because, as I said, once you open the bottle, it can last for such a long time. So if they have like a different glass pours on their menu, that's a really great size for them. But if you have a party, that might be fun too. But the 720 ml is really, typical size you'll see around, and depending on the style of the sake, how much the rice is polished, essentially it boils down to the cost to produce it. So, if you're polishing more at that higher level, like ginjo or daiginjo, you need a lot more of those raw ingredients to get the same yield. So that's really what's going to drive those costs up. And then also they're working with certain pressing methods or filtration methods that are a lot more labor intensive and delicate. So those can drive up the pricing. But sake pricing, is pretty tied to the quality or the production size. So you can know by looking at the shelf kind of what you're getting. But for an imported sake from Japan, at the basic Junmai level, a quality sake can go anywhere from about $19.99 to $25.99. So that's a good place to start. And then if you want something a little more middle tier, that's sort of next level where you're getting those really beautiful aromatics and right acidity, you'll see those prices, kind of between $25.99 and maybe $34.99. So that's that mid range for imported sake. And then at the highest level, those bottles can warrant a much larger price tag, such as, at the low end, even like $50 a bottle, all the way up to $500 a bottle. So they can get kind of high, depending oftentimes on the methods and also how much of it is produced. But I'd say if you're just starting out, you want to find imported sake to really, understand what real Japanese sake is, and try and find something, I think, in the low to mid 20s, and that'll give you a good quality sake bottle that you can enjoy sipping on.
Yeah, it's good to like. There's some comfort in you telling us that you get what you pay for. Essentially, it's like you spend a little more, you're going to get a little better quality. There's no guarantee you're going to love it, just like wine. But but like finer wines, generally speaking, you spend a little more, you're going to get a higher quality beverage. So that's good to know. So one of the things we have a vested interest, obviously, in speaking about the Joto brand of sake. But the one thing that really struck me when I came to co-brand and discovered the Joto brand was that it is actually a great brand to kind of get started with, because usually you look at some of these sake bottles and there's like Japanese all over them and you can't even understand what's happening. But I feel like the Joto brand specifically, the labels are like kind of make it very inviting and friendly to the average person who's just trying to get started. So like, again, we have a vested interest. This isn't an advertisement for Joto, but it's one of the brands that I personally think is a good place to start.
And it's very eye-catching, and that was the idea. If you have you're walking into a wine store, there's so much on the shelves, and how do you navigate that? So the whole premise for the inception of the Jodo brand was to create something that was familiar and eye-catching, had a story on the bottle. The design is very much tied to the story of the sake. So nothing is taken for granted there. And then it's all made by our producers that we've already had long-term importing relationships with, because our Jodo brand, while it's really, like you said, created to be a stepping off point for many people just to getting into sake, we import over 40 different sakes from 10 different family-owned breweries, their own brands. So our portfolio is large, but it's the same name, so it gets a little confusing. But if you see the word Joto on the bottle, that is sake that we have hand selected from our producers that we feel is a really good representation of that style, delivered at hopefully a very competitive price point for what it is, and with very accessible packaging that makes it easy to pick up. And even if the retailer knows nothing about about it, you can read right on the label there and get a sense for what you're about to take home and drink.
Yeah. I'll leave a link in the show notes for in case our listener is is driving her on the elliptical right now, listening. So another thing that I always like had a hard time navigating with sake is, like we talked about before, my first introduction was at a sushi restaurant. I can't quite disconnect sake from sushi, but I'm sure that there are other ways, other like food pairings. Could you give us just really basic ideas on like how to like what to pair sake with other than raw fish?
Yeah, and this is my favorite thing to talk about because I actually started in the culinary side of the industry. So my passion for sake really evolved from my passion from
Oh,
food.
okay.
Yeah. And I always tell
Interesting.
people in Japan, the cuisine is so multifaceted and intricate and versatile. There's restaurants that really focus on one specific method or style of cooking. So, you mentioned sushi, obviously, one of Japan's most famous exports, cultural exports to the world, sushi. But there's also ramen, and there's also yakitori, which is grilled skewers, traditional izakaya food, which is Japanese sake bar in Japan. Can be anything from deep fried croquettes, cheesy croquettes, to grilled fish, to pickled vegetables, to bowls of rice with various toppings. So these are all things that go fantastic with sake. And even if that exact style or Japanese food is not available to you, those methods are something that we're very familiar with. I mean, yakitori is grilled skewers of meat. So, in the summertime when I'm grilling or we have barbecue, I mean, sake is a great pairing with that. Pickled vegetables, you have sandwiches with pickles or, some fresh vegetables during the summer in a salad with a little vinaigrette, is a similar acidity and crunch, and sake goes great with that. The noodle dishes in Japan are wide and varied, so there's actually a growing appreciation for Japanese Italian fusion in Japan, and it's actually come here too. So you see like kind of like a Japanese style carbonara where there's like a creamy sauce on a chewy noodle, but maybe there's a couple of ingredients that are more Japanese. But that's to say, pizza, pasta, cream based dishes, any like cheese and charcuterie are fantastic with sake. So I think it's really fun when you're invited over to a friend's house for dinner or a party to bring a bottle of sake and start with that. It really gets the party going. And it's also kind of a conversation starter because some people will come over and say, "Oh, what's that?" And you can try it with whatever you're eating. I guarantee you'll find something that really sings. It doesn't have the acidity and the tannin like wine. So it's actually a lot more friendly to food pairings, such that, I've worked with chefs that have been shocked at how easy it is to pair sake with things like asparagus or tomato, which are kind of notoriously difficult to pair with wine.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I was just going to ask you, can you pair it with artichokes?
Oh, yeah. Yes.
All right,
You
well, there you go.
sake with vegetables and all those different weird flavors. Sake has, what we call umami, that fifth sense or taste on the palate, which is really due to the amino acidity in the sake, which is unlike any other beverage really in the world. So it really pairs well with a lot of food and acts more of as a support as opposed to like a competitor.
So way more than just raw fish.
Yeah, way more than just raw fish. Heck, even just grab a bag of potato chips and sit outside and have a glass of sake with it. And you'll be delightfully surprised.
All right, cool. So we've got World Sake Day coming up very shortly. Hopefully, the listeners is hearing this before October 1st, so they can get ready and pick up some bottles or find a sake bar and celebrate. Any parting words from the world of sake from your perspective?
Just that, give it a try if you haven't before. It's something fun to learn about and taste and add to your repertoire of food and drink. There's so much pride and passion that goes into making sake that it's really a fun thing to celebrate and to honor and enjoy from time to time. So I just say kampai, which means cheers. So I hope you enjoy a glass of sake for World Sake Day and beyond. but hopefully the harvest season is a good impetus to dive in.
Great. Ryan, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to my conversation with Ryan Mellinger. We hope you learned enough today to give sake a try. Please check the show notes to learn more about sake. The link to the Joto Sake website is there, as well as ways to connect with Ryan on social media. I'll be back again with another episode in about 2 weeks. In the meantime, if you want to get back to the subject of wine, please visit wine365.com. And remember, wine and sake is food. It comes from a place. Enjoy it responsibly.